This episode contains references to suicide. This is Stranger Than Fiction with Daniel Caine. This episode explores how we can communicate through consciousness, but with whom are we communicating? Mist rolled eerily over the steep banks from the river's surface and carpeted the floodplain in a low hang. The meadowland had the air of a graveyard without graves, and the occasional snapping twig from unseen nocturnal scurrying in the undergrowth all around threatened and harried the darkest depths of the imagination as awareness slowly began to return. Any faint light from the distant row of houses on the estate backing onto the vestige tract of land that clung to the river's suburban meanderings was lost as soon as the dazed man traipsed still mindlessly on across the footbridge, where the only companion left to the senses was a distant orange halo glow filtering through the tree line from the motorway up ahead on the unlit narrow access lane along which the man now found himself slowly walking. He had no idea as to his whereabouts, and didn't know what had possessed him to slip out into the night alone and obliviously hike what must have been several kilometers from the comfort of his home. The return to full awareness, though, brought with it a sense of vulnerability in the surrounding darkness. Each of his steps on the gravel underfoot now seemed to echo back at him from behind, and with the sudden chill down his spine, he became sure that someone was following. In sudden terror, he exploded into a sprint equal to the pounding in his chest and covered the next 200 meters of track in a peripheral blur of shadowy gnarled undergrowth, but began tiring and sucking for air. The orange glow of safety at the end of the lane was almost within reach, and he gritted against the burn in his lungs. Seconds later, he burst out onto the tarmac of the roundabout intersection situated beneath the motorway overpass and was blinded by the sweeping headlights of a passing car heading for the on-ramp. With a check over his shoulder, he bent over in exhaustion, unable to run a step further. He stared back at the opening to the dark laneway he had just escaped from. All was quiet and still, except for his own painful laboured gasps for air against the fading sound of high-speed tread on asphalt as the passing car accelerated away. It was then that 35-year-old Isaac McKinnon first heard a voice whispering inside his head. Sanctuary, sanctuary, sanctuary was all it kept repeating. He truly thought he must be going insane. He just didn't know yet what forces were calling to him. Nor did he realize that his presence in the laneway had just disturbed a serial killer before they'd had chance to slice open the throat of another victim that had been dragged unconscious into the undergrowth. It's brave to admit that you hear voices in the way that the character Isaac McKinnon in the book Matter of Time hears voices. It leaves a person wide open to such labels as delusional, psychotic, and insane. But what if those voices guide you and the information received proves to be startlingly correct and of help? How fine is the line between pathological delusion and intuitive perception? That is one of the themes in the book Matter of Time, and a question that I've had to ask and answer myself. I had nothing particular on my mind as I entered the shopping mall and approached the descending escalator leading to the shops on the lower basement level. But as my foot lifted to step onto the staircase, a clear, distinctive voice from nowhere spoke in my ear. "Go to High Street Armadale," it said, in a tone devoid of emotion, giving no clue as to a possible reason why. Unfortunately, at that precise instant, the weight transfer of my forward motion onto the steps had just reached a 0 point, and I hung momentarily torn between equal and opposite forces. Both gravity and momentum said down, but the voice and my body's core stabilizers said go back, I was left embarrassingly writhing in midair before stumbling inelegantly between the landing level and the constantly moving staircase. My foot started to skate off into the splits, and with one almighty and painful effort, I pulled myself upright and hopped back onto the landing in some vain hope that no one had noticed my clumsy antics, and then self-consciously hurried off back through the mall's main entrance and headed for the car park. It seemed that my plans for the morning had just been changed. I'd learnt not to ignore that woman's voice whenever she spoke. 20 minutes later, I sat down at a table in some random cafe I'd wandered into on High Street in Armadale. There were countless cafes, bars and restaurants along the 1.5-kilometre stretch of suburban road, and this place seemed as good a choice as any. I had no idea of what I was looking for, but I'd come to accept that such cryptic instructions were simply meant to be acted upon, without question, even if no resolution seemed immediately apparent. And this occasion proved to be no different. After 40 minutes, I was still sitting at the table alone, at a loss, and looking as though I'd been stood up for a lunch date. So I decided to pay for the coffee and head home. As I exited the cafe, though, I could not have known that my world was about to collapse like a house of cards. On the sidewalk outside, 3 tables along, was my then wife engaged in a very intimate conversation with a guy I'd never seen before. I watched on in breathless shock as she laughed girlishly with a flick of her hair and playfully stroked the guy's hand. I had no idea, no suspicion in the slightest. But that woman's voice that whispers in my ear wanted me to know. I walked past the table and caught my wife's eye, not even waiting for her reaction. I simply continued to walk. The life I had known had been lost forever. That woman's voice, usurping my auditory centres, was something that I'd got used to over the years, but there were times that I would in no way be left guessing on being directed to a location. Go to the public phones in the food court of Forest Hills Shopping Centre, she said. I was actually walking into a bank for an appointment, and the shopping centre was 40 minutes' drive away. And without a word, I turned and headed back to my car, leaving me as a no-show at the bank. 50 minutes later, I was standing at the public phones in the food court, glancing around in case anything of significance struck me. And after a further 10 minutes, I skulked over to a free phone, picked it up and pretended to be on a call, hoping that it would make me less conspicuous as I scanned the space. But after 2 minutes of feeling utterly ridiculous, I placed down the receiver and turned to walk off, just as the guy on the phone next to me placed his receiver down and turned to walk off too. I was just ahead of him and was more than surprised when I heard him call my name. I turned and looked up at the tall, well-built man, but didn't recognize him in the slightest. And on realizing my confusion, he identified himself with just his first name. It took me a few seconds. There was something about the eyes and something about the voice. Then it dawned. The last time I'd seen the man, he'd been a skinny teenager, the younger brother of a friend of mine that I'd lost contact with years before, not under the best of circumstances. But I'd heard, through a friend of a mutual acquaintance, that she was having a baby, and I'd been wondering if she was okay. I had never stopped caring, and had often wondered how life was treating her. And when I'd recently heard she was pregnant, my concern had only heightened. The brother and I exchanged broad smiles and shook hands. "How's your sister?" He beamed back at me. "I was just on the phone to the hospital," he said. "She's just had the baby, and they're both fine." That woman, who whispers in my ear, had known all about my concerns over that mother and baby, and with perfect timing, had guided me to the place I needed to be to let me know that everything was okay and as it should be. Again, I emphasize that I am not suggesting such experiences prove that some guardian angel follows our every step through life. And equally, I am not discounting that possibility. We just don't know. It's one thing to perceive information, but the information perceived can be processed by us in so many ways to form any number of conclusions and create any number of paradigms. What I am suggesting, though, is that such experiences unequivocally prove that our awareness can reach out across space and time and gain information that would not be available to us if the source of all information was solely confined to the neural network activity of each individual's isolated and separate brain, as the majority view of science believes. But it's not only science that would consider someone hearing voices as being delusional, psychotic, and insane. Any reasonable individual hearing voices would and should consider that possibility too.